Before watching this video, you'll want to have seen the review I did on The Art of Atomhawk Design Volume 1, or at least be familiar with it yourself, as I will be making extensive comparisons between the two, and not in order to pit them against one another. That's the beauty of a good series. They're not in competition, they're two sides of the same coin. The comparisons are just because they are very different, so you need to understand that to have the right expectations. But also because it's fascinating to compare the art book ideas present in both, because Volume 2 has made some huge improvements towards becoming a more refined visual showcase. I love that they didn't just lazily fall back on the comfort of what's been done before. For books creators to actually have an interest in assessing ways to improve on their work is so rare and admirable, so that's fantastic. But the fact is there are also parts where this book's not as good as the first, really only in one area, but we'll get into that later. This one was funded through Kickstarter and released in 2015, so 4 years after Volume 1. One of the first changes you'll notice is that the format has switched from portrait to landscape. This isn't an improvement in the sense of one format being intrinsically superior to the other. It's about how you use them and the book you're making. But in this case anyway, it ends up being of incalculable benefit to the layout of the images because it seems to have curbed the previous book's insane proclivity for running images across the gutter, with only a select couple of 2-page spreads being exceptions. The format switch might cause your OCD to flare up, however, since now they can't be displayed uniformly next to one another on a shelf. They also dropped the word design from the title, so going forward the books are just called The Art of Atomhawk. The book's hardcover this time round, but doesn't come standard with a slipcase as the first did. I imagine that was done to shift production costs to more important physical qualities, i.e. the paper quality has been given a slight bump to bring it up to par. However, there was a slipcase available for the 500 deluxe editions. I do love me a slipcase, but can just never justify the cost either from the production or consumer side. Where Volume 1 largely used black paper, this one has switched to more white, which was a good idea, because unless you really need it for a specific effect, black paper doesn't work as well because it's more reflective and displays marks easier. The great strength of this book is, as I said, its refinement as an Atomhawk visual showcase. The first book only contained work from 2.5 artists and not really anything from the company's 15 clients. They did try to add a bit of aesthetic diversity, but overall it was a rather visually homogeneous book. By Volume 2, the company had grown to 19 employees and 40 clients. In the introduction, they say they wanted this book to show the breadth of style and genre, and it shows, and it is wonderful to behold. Everything is now organized by project, making it far easier to tell where what you're looking at is from, so that's a huge improvement. There's about 16 games or projects that are given their own chapters. One issue the book has carried over from the first is that it feels like it's failing to be representative of the full history of Atomhawk's work. Sometimes this has been done for brilliant reasons, i.e. for clients where they just do a poster or UI design. Obviously that isn't worth taking up space here. Probably the best curation decision this whole Atomhawk series of books makes, the thing that makes them truly valuable in my eyes, is that they almost exclusively focus on giving the space to projects that don't already have their own art books, with the exception of the Order 1888 and the mini art books that came with the Mortal Kombat Collector's Editions. But for example, they've produced artwork for the Marvel movies, but there is not a single piece of it in here, and that's awesome, because they all have their own art books, so giving the space to smaller or art book deprived projects, yeah, that to me is the best thing this series has done. However, the flip side of that is that there are projects that they've worked on that should have been in here but are completely absent. Again, like the first book, they don't even include a page listing all the stuff the company's worked on. Not having a more comprehensive showing of all they've worked on runs counter to the whole idea of these books, and particularly inexcusable when they're wasting space on stuff I'll mention in a minute. And at 180 pages, which is fine, but really, considering how much they need to cover, they should be adding at least another 40. On the plus side, even though it's got 10 fewer pages than the first volume, overall it actually still includes a notably greater number of artworks. This is because the layout is excellent, except for 2 cases. One, while there's not tons of full-page images, there are still too many for a book that has so much to cover, and biggest inherent weakness being that they can only show barely a handful of images per project. It doesn't have the space to waste on such extravagant displays when it needs to be doing everything it can to be getting as much content in here as possible in order to justify its value. The other unimpressive aspect of the layout is the opening page of each chapter, which contains a few sentences of text and then a huge cropped version of a repeated piece already in the chapter, and then 60% blank space. 2 other inclusions inclusions that are taking up space that could be used on more worthwhile content are 1. Personal pieces from the artists are back again, this time better organized and collected at the back, and they're great pieces. I love the art and they deserve to be in a book. I just don't think it's this book. I know these artists are the company, but they've got too many artists working on too many projects to contain in even a regular series of books, so it's wiser to just have the focus be on stuff the company collectively worked on, because getting a satisfying showing of that is already the book's biggest challenge, but then also having 2 or 3 personal pieces from a couple of artists isn't a meaningful or satisfying showing of their work either. A far worse, absolutely absurd and inappropriate waste was that for the Kickstarter they allowed random non-Atomhawk people to buy space in the book to include their own artwork. That is the stupidest, worst inclusion in this whole series. Only marginally less terrible is the 10 pages of digital art tutorials. They're written in first person, but we're never told who the artist is, and it's not that the tutorials are bad, it's why are they in here taking up space? It doesn't fit with the book. None of it's specific to Atomhawk, and wasteful to the readers who are here for the art, nor is 10 pages of random tutorials satisfying for those eager to learn digital art when there are dedicated books, and better mediums for that, i.e. video tutorials, and as if in proof of that, the deluxe edition came with online access to longer art tutorial videos from the artists. Plus the other thing is, except for one, the tutorials didn't seem to be about creating any of the pieces for actual client work, so it just feels like they were created for the sake of the tutorial and not relevant to getting any specific insight into the project shown. The tutorial that is on work from one of the projects is definitely the most interesting just because it felt like more practical and relevant behind the scenes insight. So had it just been a couple like that, that would have been fine. But the way it's been done here, at the expense of more important stuff, makes it an absolutely pointless inclusion. Conversely, the best inclusions of the book, and indeed the whole series, as I've said, has been the ability to identify and primarily focus on the most deserving or valuable projects, based on the idea of them being smaller, lesser known, and not having their own art books or otherwise unlikely to ever be seen elsewhere. I was more enthralled by the IPs that I'd never seen or heard of before. That's probably because of the novelty. With something like Mortal Kombat, maybe I haven't seen those specific artworks, but it's still pretty familiar stuff, as opposed to something like Project Spark, which is also something that has been abandoned. So what a great way to preserve something of the work done on that. I just wish there was more. Though, having said that, I also would have loved more Harry Potter since what's here is so good. But considering Atomhawk worked on 2 games and has been producing Pottermore stuff for 5 years, it feels like precious little. That the sensation that there's not enough on anything for it to be satisfying is a problem inherent with the anthology approach. But I guess my point is that, be that as it may, the curation has struck a remarkable balance in what it's chosen. Let's have Injustice in here because that's popular, so people want to see it, but not give it more space just because of that at the expense of shortchanging something else that's lesser known, but perhaps more interesting and deserving of being in here because of that. Speaking of which, probably the single biggest inclusion in any of these books is found in this one, and that's the work done on The Realm. It started as an internal project just to conceptualize and collaborate on creating a hypothetical IP. Later they tried to kickstart it as a real game, and though that didn't work out, it shows why a book like this is so great, because at least it lives on here to be enjoyed. I love conceptual pitches and world building for imagined ideas like this that don't actually exist, and even though, like with Necessary Force and Neo Racer from the first book, I personally don't actually like the aesthetic or setting of The Realm either, but I love their inclusions in these books as stuff that otherwise would go unseen and helps give the books a unique Atomhawk identity and value, rather than just feeling like a collection of micro art books on things that they happen to work on. It's something original that, unlike the random personal pieces from the artists, has been worked on as a group and is more substantial and enjoyable because it's a more robust shared vision. So The Realm gets the most content of any project in the book, as it should. It's a great creative exercise that I'm glad gets to be shared with the world while also adding to the strength and value of the book. What doesn't add strength and value to the book is the abysmal text. This is the biggest step back from the first book, where the captions were far better and more informational. Now, in calling Volume 1 informational, keep in mind that the text was a minor feature and only occasional comments that were great in a one-sentence kind of way. It's not something something you're going to buy the book for. But as far as that goes, it was mostly very well done and interesting, so a great inclusion nonetheless, as opposed to the Volume 2 text, which is completely pointless. There's two types of text. Artist commentary, which except for the realm is otherwise almost entirely absent from the rest of the book. Instead, what's making up most of the text is stuff from an unidentified author who, despite writing from the collective company perspective of we at Atomhawk, the content of the text comes across like it was written by some outsider who didn't have knowledge of the creation or access to the creators, and had to desperately meet their word count, so generated what text they could vomit up on their own, because most of it is just superficial text describing the image you're looking at, and the tone and style is that awful, light-hearted corporate PR style. 5% of the information is actually good and interesting, 95% is insipid, obvious, meaningless blather, frequently lacking specificity, actual interest, and explanation of whys especially. Too many shallow statements that sound like they could lead to something insightful, but because they're rarely followed up with any explanations or whys, it's rendered completely meaningless. Too often I'd read something that left me thinking, okay, and that's when they're actually talking about the art itself and not just describing characters or what you're looking at. Then in addition to that and dedicated tutorial pages, there's also too much text throughout that's just like tips from some sort of concept art 101 book. And you could say it's about inspiring aspiring artists. Okay, well, you know what's more inspiring and educational than being spoken down to with basic, obvious art theory? Having the artist actually point out and explain things about working on a piece that aren't obvious. Real, practical examples and insight that don't treat the reader like a child. The only time the text is better than the first is the opening of each chapter, because it actually gives that context that was missing from Volume 1, but they're still too short and surrounded by 2 to 3 times more empty space that should have been used for more background and information, or even art, of course. Even though the best part about the curation of both volumes is the decision to focus on the unseen or lesser seen or just more deserving, but even though that's something they share, there's also a big difference in the nature of that curation. Basically, it comes down to how much content each provides per project. Volume 1 has fewer projects, making it enjoyable for being visually deeper. Volume 2 has more projects, making it enjoyable for being visually broader. This means that even though Volume 2 has quite a bit of visual development type work, that seems to be less of a focus than showing final art, which it probably does too much of in this book, causing it to lose a lot of that visual exploration compared to Volume 1, which had more space per project to include a lot of that early, alternate, and discarded stuff. I could be wrong about Volume 2 leaning more heavily towards final art. It's hard to say for sure, because even though Volume 1 was terrible at giving context as basic as telling you what project something was for, there were also a lot of cases where the captions were explicit and insightful with a piece's use in history, telling us if it's an early work or a final piece or was cut or changed. Volume 2 rarely does that, which takes away some interest and makes me feel like too much is just final looking stuff. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. In fact, it can be really good. Unlike art books on individual games that feature too much final work, which is bad because the expectation there should be that your audience is familiar with the game, so final stuff isn't interesting. But for an anthology, and particularly one like this that focuses on projects that don't have their own art books, that's not a problem, particularly as someone who does tend to enjoy art that is more polished and highly rendered compared to the speed painting type look you do get with a lot of development work. But yeah, it's not about either approach being necessarily better or worse, just that it is something that may be more or less appealing based on personal preference that you should be aware of. And it's just interesting to compare the strengths and weaknesses of each approach in terms of what makes for a successful art book. The first volume was better from the informational making of and visual development perspective. It was more insightful and satisfying in terms of being able to dedicate more content per project, but it's also a book that is clunky and visually narrow, whereas Volume 2 is better in terms of an eye-candy visual showcase gallery. It's better presented and has more stuff to look at, but it's also a shallow book. But this is part of the fun and interest in taking books of the same series and considering the strengths and weaknesses of each that would be a lot hard to appreciate just viewing them individually. So far I've only sort of danced around what is actually the biggest issue, or perhaps limitation, with these books, and that is the concept, the nature of wide-ranging anthology books like these, but that's something we'll go into in the next video, which will be on the Art of Atomhawk Volume 3.